And I see that we have a mix, I think, of home gardeners who are just here to learn, and perhaps people that may be interested or new to selling produce from their market garden, which, market garden we would think would be maybe small scale production that's then sold locally, either to neighbors or farmers markets, just some sort of use beyond what someone would be using personally out of their own garden. So I want to talk about a few things to keep in mind whenever we're thinking about that, from going from that personal garden to a garden where we're going to be using it for sales or other things where we want to maybe make a little money. So one of the first things to think about are the goals that we have. There we go. So what are our goals with our market garden? So some people do it to earn extra income. I plant an extra row of beans or tomatoes or something like this, and I just earn a few extra dollars. Maybe sort of help pay for my gardening by getting a little income, or I can build up and actually build a farm business from that. Maybe I'm a good at gardening and have some skill, and I have the land or the access to land to do that, and I want to build a farm in order to actually build my own business and to have more income from that. But then there are other things that we can think of beyond the income and business. Feeding the community. I've seen several people say something about, I want to grow this, and yes, I want to make money so I can pay for it, but I'm really feeding my community. It can be a hobby or a fun or something challenging to do, just something different to do. Then we have things like social impact. We see a lot of that when we're growing food in neighborhoods where maybe there's not a lot of access to food, and especially around foods that are hard to find at the grocery store, say for our immigrant populations, or even, today is, we think about our native populations and the access to food that maybe people don't find at the grocery store. So it can just be a fun challenge, even with all these things kept in mind. So the next question is, what can I legally do? So if you're in a rural area, if you're not part of a town or a city or a township, usually there are no restrictions. This would be, any restriction would be on the county level, and you could check to see, where can I have what, or what can I grow? How big can I grow? What can I do in terms of like structures or equipment? Those kinds of things. If you live within a city or a town, though, there are probably local codes and ordinances that might restrict some of that. Zoning restrictions, you're probably within a residential area. We also have neighbor relationships to keep in mind. If the neighbors aren't sort of happy with what you're doing, that can be an issue. Those local codes and ordinances, not only do you have to look at the city codes and ordinances, but if you happen to live in a neighborhood that might have an HOA or some sort of other covenant rules, you would have to check with those. And then at least most of the cities that I have seen, the neighbor relationships really play into it, because a lot of the restrictions are what we would call complaint-based, meaning that the city or town isn't out patrolling around looking for big gardens, or, they're not looking for things like chickens. But if your neighbor complains to the city, then they'll send someone out to look for it. And right now we're going through this process in Omaha. We've been having public meetings, but we have a new ordinance draft that will go before city council. We've been sort of introducing it to people to talk about things like this, because currently, there are no ordinances on the books, which means technically that you cannot have an urban farm or even a community garden in Omaha, because it legally doesn't exist. And so there's a legal gray area. So we're trying to create protections for those, but then the city also has to, do all the zoning and the permits and stuff. So we've been having public meetings around that. And if you're in the city of Omaha, or if you're in one of the local neighborhoods around Omaha and you have questions, feel free to reach out to me, because I do have that, and I can let you know when the public meetings are. So the next question is, well, how will you sell? Where will you sell? We always think of a farmer's market if we're selling local produce, which is one option. But there are, I think, other places to get to before we go there, because usually there's either a commitment, like how many weeks are you going to be at the farmer's market, or even like an application fee. How much am I going to pay to be there? And maybe you aren't there yet. Maybe, if you only have, an extra few bushels of green beans or tomatoes this year, maybe going to a farmer's market isn't something that you need to do because you just don't have the volume yet. But you can always sell to neighbors, even through social media. Now we have like the marketplace apps on Facebook and places like that, where you could advertise to neighbors in your neighborhood to say, I have this for sale, and maybe sell through that. You can also go to local businesses, say a local grocery store or a local restaurant, and ask, what local produce are you looking for? And, I have this for sale. And as you grow a business, you would maybe want to ask that question up front. What do I need to plant to grow for you? If I'm going to a local restaurant, they're looking for something certain, or even a grocery store. So if you're going to make this a bigger venture, you might want to reach out and see what you can sell locally. And then a farm stand. So here's a good example. This one is on Ponca Road in Omaha. These are some friends of mine, and they have other businesses. They have, in the winter, they make candies and caramels and sell through like local gift shops. And then they have a farm as well. And they call their business the Perennial Homestead. And they set everything out here. It's sort of a pay on your own. So they put out produce, they have canned goods, they have flowers, they do like vegetable transplants and herbs. And you can go there and buy stuff from their farm. And it's just this little farm stand that they built. And I've seen several of these, and there's a few of them even around the Omaha area. So whenever you're thinking about what enterprise to do, as we're going from maybe a large gardener to a small farmer, is maybe the way that I envision this. So what do you pick to do, and what do you plan to do? So you're going to assess the possible production area. How much space do I have to grow stuff? And also assess the consumer demands. I talked about going to grocery stores or to restaurants to ask what they want, but even think about, what are you seeing a lot of people buying at the grocery store? What is at the farmer's market that you see people buying? Or even, what is at the farmer's market? So I don't need to grow tomatoes and beans if everyone else is growing tomatoes and beans. I need to maybe find something different that I'm good at growing. And then if we're getting started and we have a small volume of stuff, we probably want to concentrate on stuff that's of higher value. And I'll talk about that in a bit, about what that means in terms of vegetables. And that also plays into intensifying space usage. Like, I have a very limited space. I'm a market garden. I don't have thousands of acres to grow lots of stuff to sell. So what am I going to grow on a small scale that would be able to get me income and to at least pay for itself, if not make money? And so we can talk about those in terms of space, and we think about that in terms of volume. So we have a small space. That means we're going to have a lower volume of production. And so we need to select those crops of high value. And so we look at the margin versus the sales. So we look at, how much of this do I have versus how much can I sell it for? So if I have something that's of a low value and I can only grow a few pounds of it, then I'm not going to make my money back by selling that, because I don't have enough of it to sell to make a large amount of money. So if we think about stuff like, if we're raising like corn and soy, like on a big farm scale, they grow a lot of it, but it has a relatively low value per unit, per pound, or per bushel. So in a vegetable garden, if I'm just starting out, I want to pick stuff that maybe, yes, it's stuff I'm good at growing and I like to grow, but something that has a little higher value, because then I can get a return on investment versus something that's low volume and low value. And so, I'm not going to go into this, a great deal, but we want to look at like this upper part here, where we're selling small amounts that are a high value to farmers, roadside stand, farmers markets, roadside stands, direct to consumers, or maybe direct to restaurants and grocery stores. You'll get a little bit less money selling to something like that than selling to a person, because it's still a quote wholesale type of sale, but you'll typically get more than what we would call like a commodity pricing, where I'm growing a lot of it and I sell it, for very cheap. And where we get in really big danger is if we have a low volume and we also have a low value. And so we want to avoid that. Specifically, if I'm going from a home garden to a market garden, I'm going to be low volume, especially in the very beginning, unless I'm going to ramp up and become like this big farm business. So let's talk about some of those vegetable crops, high value vegetable crops. And some of these you might think about, well, those are cheap at the grocery store or at the farmer's market. But then we have to think about the volume of them that you can produce. So tomatoes, of course, a high value, but basically everyone and their uncle at the farmer's market has tomatoes. And so you can grow tomatoes, especially if you have a special type of tomato you grow. Things like cucumbers and peppers and summer squash and broccoli and beans are all on here. Garlic is a good one as well. But you see things like green onions and beets and turnips, and you don't think about those as high volume or high value crops, but you have to think about the way that you can grow them. Green onions, you can grow green onions relatively quickly and in a small space. So if you're going by like intensive growing practices and you look at the distance on a seed packet, it says to plant scallion plants like 2 inches apart. That means you can get 16 green onion plants in a square foot. And then you can harvest them relatively quickly. Same thing for things like leaf lettuce, etc. Herbs are usually good because you can plant them once and harvest multiple times, cut leaves off of them to harvest. And so we either have to have something that the product itself is either high dollar value, or something where the actual volume of the plant makes up for the lower value. Like a bundle of green onions is $1, but you can produce lots of bundles of green onions in a small space. So low value vegetable crops. So some of these might be surprising too. So corn, of course, you can sell, sweet corn by the dozen or whatever, and you do get a decent amount of money for it. But if you think about the size of the plant and how much space it takes up to grow enough corn to sell, in a small space, it's not usually worth it. Same thing for potatoes. Potatoes, unless you're growing like specialty little, like fingerling potatoes, or, potatoes of different colors, they're typically lower value, or higher value. But if you're growing stuff like just a baking potato, you can go to the grocery store and buy, 10 pounds of potatoes for $3, and it takes a lot of space to grow that 10 pounds. In a small garden. And then things like pumpkins, melons, and winter squash, those items are high value items. So if you go, this time of year and you buy a pumpkin, I've seen some places selling them for like between $6 and $10 a piece. But you only get a few good sized pumpkins per plant. Same things for melons and some of the winter squash. So you have a very big plant that only produces a small number of things to sell. And so if you look at the space versus the value, these might not be a good investment for small space crops. We can also do things like interplanting, where we're putting different things at growing times together. And we can also make best use of our space. If we start early and grow early spring cool season crops like lettuce or leafy greens, and then we can go ahead and plant our tomatoes or peppers in there while they're still finishing up, and then come in and sow something around those tomatoes before, for a fall crop. And so we can make good value and good use of our space by interplanting. So things like on the right here, we have lettuce that's fast growing around broccoli that's slow growing. And so we would get a harvest of lettuce done before the broccoli is really up to size. Here we have a high tunnel at the bottom. If you don't know what a high tunnel is, it's a protected structure, sort of like an unplanted or unheated greenhouse. And they've got tomatoes growing in there, but I think this is, early season. So they started off with lettuce along the sides of it to make use of that space before the tomato plants get big and take over the space. And so they're intensifying the use of space because they have a small space. We can also grow horizontally. So if we are doing some of those vining crops, we want to grow up instead of out. So if you're doing pole beans or cucumbers or squash or even melons, things of that nature, you want to be able to trellis them instead of just letting them grow on the ground. That will allow you to grow more of them and have a higher value than just letting them grow all over the ground, especially if you have limited space in order to grow them. And then fruit crops. What I will say is that, especially in our area, most fruit crops are high value because they aren't grown very commonly. It's a little harder to grow fruit here because of all of our disease pressure and our climate. And so we can grow fruits. And if you're good at growing fruits, you can always sell them probably to neighbors or to farmers markets or to grocery stores if you can grow good quality fruits. And so you can, if you have a small area, select smaller plants and some of those more unusual fruits. So things like strawberries and elderberry and aronia berry, those are common higher value things that you can grow for sale. If you do want to do some of the fruit trees, you would select dwarf fruit trees like an apple or a pear. I will say if you are investing in growing fruit, you would not want to invest in trees that don't do well here. And unfortunately, everyone wants to grow things like peaches, but peaches just don't grow well here. And so you want to pick things that will grow well here, but also not take up a lot of space. Things like raspberry and blackberry would also be high value and small space. And then you can also throw in those unusual and specialty fruits. Pawpaws are big. That's the big native fruit. There's a whole big list of random and wonderful wild things that you can grow to sell here that would actually make money. Then, of course, you can get fun and play around with things, find interesting ways to grow intensively on a small scale. On the left, this is a way of growing fruit trees called espalier. And basically, they're grown flat against a wall. Those, I think, are some sort of probably apple tree there, perhaps. And so then those would produce along those cordons that grow through there. You can even think about ways. So this would be like maybe a hydroponic setup with strawberries, different ways that they've been growing. And that leads us into some intensive growing methods. So this is sort of like the bigger scale of growing. But we think about new technology, old methods, and we're going to increase productivity because we're either going to grow throughout the winter using like a greenhouse or something, or at least extend our season with low tunnels and high tunnels and things like that. But then we talk about how we grow stuff. So if we have a big space, we typically see things planted in rows like this. There's usually lots of space between them to allow for tractors or other implements to get through there. But if we're growing in a small scale, if I'm wanting to do this in my backyard as a market gardener, I'll probably have closer rows or beds. And beds can even be beds without being raised beds. They don't have to be, structures that you build. You can actually just grow in beds. A good example, I've had the opportunity to visit the home of Thomas Jefferson, Monticello in Virginia. And he had this huge garden that he is renowned for. And he had stuff growing in beds. There were wide beds, and then there were like aisles of lawn between them that were maintained. And so there are, different ways of growing to grow stuff in a smaller space that then you would be able to grow enough to sell. And then we think about plant sizes. That goes back to that value and what I'm growing and how much space I have to grow. Are a big plants worth the investment? So on the left here, I have a zucchini plant. That is one thing. I've grown zucchini in my garden once. And I just decided that I would never grow it again because, number one, everyone else is growing zucchini. And I don't even have to buy zucchini. Like, people want to give it away. And if you're actually looking at the size of a zucchini plant, a full-grown zucchini plant can take up like 10 square feet of garden space. And if you're doing a small growing space, that's a lot of space. So small plants maximize space if their value is high. And we talked about, things like carrots and onions. You don't think about being high value, but you can grow enough of them in a small space that even though they have a lower value themselves, you can actually grow enough of them to make it worth your time and money. We have high tunnels. This is for, those higher level growers. This would be if you're in this for the long haul and want to become a small farmer. They're unheated, but they are a greenhouse structure, and they are in-ground production. So you grow right into the ground, like right here. There are government grants that you can get if you want to start one of these through the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, that can be used to defray most of the cost of one of these if you are interested. And then there are greenhouses, heated year-round, grow transplants, growing container plants, doing indoor vegetables like hydroponics. And so these are usually a bigger investment because you have structure, you have utilities, you have to heat them, you have to have usually some sort of watering system or fertilization system. Microgreens, this is one if you have a very small space, but you want to give growing a try. Microgreens can be a good investment because it's a quick turnaround. It's usually like 1 to 3 weeks between sowing and selling. They're very high value, and there's an emerging market. You see these, and they're in and around the Omaha area. We might be getting close to, like, we have enough producers, but there's restaurants. I see them at farmers markets every week. There's lots of opportunity for something like this, and they're reduced risk because, if you're growing tomatoes and you have a storm and it kills all your tomatoes that you've been growing for months, you've lost the entire season. If you have something that kills all your microgreens, well, you've been growing them for a week and you can just resow them. And so there are, that you don't even have to have a greenhouse. You can do like grow lights in an extra room at the house that you're temperature controlling in order to grow these. And then hydroponics, of course, this is larger scale. This is for greenhouse or indoor for year-round production. And I show this like this is a commercial setup, but this can be even simpler. I'm upset at myself because I actually have a very simple hydroponic system that I built here at the office just using rubber, like the Rubbermaid Tupperware storage containers, like the big, like 25-gallon containers. The plants are just sitting in top. There's no technology, there's no movement. The plants are just growing in a nutrient solution, and they've been growing in our courtyard for, I would say, 3 months now with nothing going on. I mean, they're growing. We've been harvesting. I've had to do nothing. There's been no input other than planting the plants. And so something even as simple as that, you could use to grow stuff. Now, just a few things to keep in mind as you are growing. If you're going from a home gardener to a market gardener, and especially as you're growing in size as a market gardener. Sarah here is our produce safety team leader for Nebraska. I'm a trainer with Sarah. The produce safety is important. So we have different trainings. There's like good agricultural practices, or there's the Produce Safety Alliance for serious growers. And that's Sarah's our team lead and I'm a trainer. And that is a training that by law farmers must follow. Now, if you sell less than $25,000 worth of produce a year, you are exempt from getting a certification. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't take the training. And the training, I think, would be helpful for anyone of any size that's a farmer, because it just talks about common sense things that you can do to reduce risks to produce and to people. And so we do have that. We have a training coming up on November 8th. If you're interested, let us know. And there are some virtual trainings coming up as well that will be available. But produce safety is definitely something to keep in mind if you are going to sell at a market or through a grocery store or restaurant. There's also taxes and financial things to think about. So if you are become an actual farm business, then that means, so you have income from selling produce. If you're a farm business, that means your expenses are deductible, which means that you can maybe even out your income versus expenses on your taxes. If you are just selling a few extra things every year, technically your income is taxable, and also you can't deduct those expenses. And so what that means is that basically, you would have extra income, but you wouldn't have the deductions in order to offset that. So you would want to think about things like that. You would want to talk to a tax professional. I am not a tax professional. I can't give you tax advice. And then sometimes those things all hinge on, are you actually a farmer or not? And especially if you're looking for those grants and loans, like I shared, and thanks, Ben, for sharing that in the chat for the NRCS EQIP grant to build a high tunnel. So who is a farmer? The USDA considers someone who has $1,000 of income from the farm, so selling produce, selling chickens, eggs, value-added products that you've made from things on the farm. If you sell $1,000 worth of, if you have $1,000 worth of income in a year over 3 out of the last 5 years, then you can be considered a farm. And so you can apply for those grants and loans through the USDA and other organizations. But also keep in mind that that means that you probably have to then file your taxes as a farm, which is a Schedule F, which is what farm income and expenses are filed under.